Good morning. This is being recorded on May 2nd, and I just want to alert you that the next recording will be made on May 30th, okay? So it's not in 2 weeks, it's in May 30th. Well, we're all watching the horrors of Ukraine and all of that, but I want to talk about human rights, war crimes, and all of this morning, not to be technical, but kind of to alert us of what this all means and could mean, and without, as I said, getting very technical, because it is important and all these terms are being thrown around. So let's address that a little bit. Now, if I could be simple-minded for a moment and say, let's look, for example, at speed limits and traffic, right? They're intended not to be for the purpose of giving tickets, speeding tickets to everybody, but rather to control the traffic and to alert people how fast they can go. And the tickets are given to those people that violate the mileages, right? So the idea of law very often is not merely to punish people, but rather to channel their behavior in some kind of direction that seems to make sense in the interest of the general public or the country or the world, right? So most of the international law and that is being bandied about in terms of this war in the Ukraine, to some extent, is a 20th century manifestation. But let me backtrack a little bit and say that there have been rules having to do with war and the behavior of military going back centuries. How do we know this? Well, it's been written about, but we also know it from movies, right? For two armies, and then they want to negotiate, and a white flag goes up that appears in a lot of movies. And everybody understood that a white flag meant you put down your arms and you either negotiate or the conflict ends. There were also tons of rules having to do with the behavior of ships, for example, in ancient times. And those rules were having to do with traffic, having to alert people, but also any violations. And those violations and or those norms were often addressed by flags going up on ships, right? A particular flag meant something. So even if you read about ancient Greek city-states or territorial states in the 17th and 18th century, there were all kinds of rules and all kinds of norms of behavior. And when the violations took place, one of two things happened. Either the conflict would escalate and continue, and or somebody would get punished in one fashion or another, either by violent means or nonviolent means for violating the rules. And so we shouldn't get the idea that no one ever thought of what constitutes a war crime or what constitutes aggression. These things have been bandied about in a kind of informal way. And where were the rules written? Well, on the whole, they weren't written. They came from something called natural law, which was intended to reflect how normal dispositions, normal behavior was enacted or was supposed to be enacted. Very often the norms came from religious teachings, Bibles, and other religious documents. And in addition to the natural law, there was the idea that there could be something resembling the writing of down or developing of norms. And when things got written down, especially beginning in the late 19th century, that was called positive law. Now, in between that was also a category said customary law. What is customary? For example, raising a white flag, right? So natural law and customary law preceded so-called positive law, which was law that was legislated amongst countries, amongst allies, which then very often became norms, but it was legislated. And so the beginnings of sort of serious development of international law pertaining to war and conflict and the behavior of soldiers, while it had its origins in the late 19th century, it really became much more serious after the First World War and the League of Nations. And some of the things that were done in the First World War were considered to be so horrendous that action needed to be taken. For example, the use of poisonous chemicals, which would attack civilians, innocent civilians. So a treaty was formed, in other words, positive law, that chemical use was forbidden. Right? So slowly in the 20th century, and I don't want to bore you with all the categories, there was a development of legislated laws, legislated either by the League of Nations or some subgroups of states about norms in warfare and particular forms of warfare which were considered inappropriate. Now, if somebody did something that was considered inappropriate, other than sort of embarrassing them and leverage, or perhaps starting a new war, there wasn't terribly much to be done about it. So then you get to the Second World War, and the beginning of thinking about how to proceed after the thinking commenced while the Second World War was still going on, but how to formulate norms, international norms having to do with warfare, with human rights, and with aggression after the Second World War ended. And the people who started thinking about them, there are two rather famous names. One is a person named Lemkin, and the other is a person named Lauterbruch. And these two chaps, independently, they weren't personal friends, they didn't even like each other, were sort of Polish, sort of Ukrainian, studied in the Ukraine, actually, at the university. But, parts of the Ukraine were at various times Polish and vice versa. So these chaps and their families navigated between Ukraine and Poland. And the one person, or the one thing we all have heard about, is genocide. And the idea of genocide, which is bandied about right now, is there genocide taking place in the Ukraine, was Mr. Lemkin's idea. Both of these guys, by the way, were lawyers, right? And Lemkin created the word genocide. Before that, this word did not exist. And he combined the Greek genus, meaning race, and Latin cide, C-I-D-E, meaning killing. So race killing. And the word genocide was coined by him and now is part of our general vocabulary. And I will get back to that for a minute. Mr. Lauterbruch had a slightly different idea, and his idea was there should be something called crimes against humanity. Now, it's useful to sort of quickly say that genocide, after became a convention, that is to say, countries signed onto it, it was legislated law, right? And it became something that countries are supposed to adhere to, not to commit genocide. And on the other hand, Mr. Lauterbruch was somewhat less successful in getting this into international law of some cases, but rather it got adopted, that is to say, crimes against humanity, got adopted by the United Nations, right? And so on the one hand, you have a convention creating international law. On the other hand, you have the United Nations through its resolutions creating international law. What is of interest, of course, is that it's not clear what's what. And even though we throw around these terms, we think we know exactly what it means. And in the case of the Ukraine, it is being thrown around that the Russians are committing genocide. But genocide actually means something very specific. It means the killing of a particular identifiable group, as in the Nazis killing Jews and the Nazis killing gypsies, for example, or the Rwandans, Tutsis and Hutus trying to annihilate each other. That is to say, known ethnic groups or religious groups or identifiable groups, just killing a lot of people without the target being a specific identifiable group is not genocide. It's crimes against humanity, it's all kinds of things, but it's not genocide. So when we're looking at Ukraine right now and they're saying the Russians are committing genocide, it might be very difficult to prove that it was genocide. That is to say, it would be a first to say that a war against a nation state is genocide. That is to say that the object is not some identifiable group, but rather the whole state. And that would require quite a lot of discussion and litigation. So international lawyers in particular are fairly careful in saying, let's not throw this word genocide around. It may very well be at the end of the day that the Russians are charged with genocide, but that really does mean adding to the content of what constitutes genocide, because just simply having a war with another country and killing everybody in sight that you can manage to kill to conquer the country is a crime of aggression, but not necessarily genocide. Now, before I go more deeply into the various categories, that is to say, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the final category is the crime of aggression. How do you proceed, other than throwing it around in the newspapers and charging these people? How would you proceed to punish anybody? Now, let me go back to the beginning. The purpose of these laws, the purpose of these conventions is to prevent people from doing those things, right? Rather than just simply a mechanism for punishing people who do them. You should know that if you target a particular group, ethnic group, or religious group, that you can be charged with genocide. You should know that if you start, killing people in warfare and punishing them and molesting them and doing all kinds of horrible things to them, that is part of the crimes against humanity. So it is meant, these laws are meant to be deterrents. Now, what happens if people are not deterred? Well, it's clear that in the case of the Russian activities in the Ukraine, deterrence seems to not be working. Right? Soldiers are doing horrible things. Those are called war crimes, right? They're binding, you have seen the horrible pictures of their hands being bound behind their backs and then shot through their head. In the last day, you might have seen the picture of one of the soldiers from the steel mill in Mariupol. He was captured. He was told that he has all his rights as a captured soldier, and then he was shot through the head, right? That is a war crime. And then you say, well, all right, so now you have an inventory. Maybe genocide is going on, but that's not so clear. Is the crime of aggression going on? Well, yes, there was aggression against, and it still is against Ukraine. On the other hand, the Russians will argue that they were just responding to aggression against the provinces in the east. So even there will be an argument. Out of control soldiers, were they not properly trained and were they were violating things, or probably not properly trained? But in any event, soldiers can do things that are not part of the military. For example, we may remember Lieutenant Cali. He was tried for crimes in Vietnam, right? He was not following orders from the U.S. military, he got it in his mind that he was going to, kill people in this village, and he was tried and convicted. So there's arguments that are going to go back and forth as to what charges can be brought and what charges can be prosecuted. Now, when the war is over, right? Or if the war goes on for 20 years or 30 years, conceivably while the war is still going on. Well, there are multiple mechanisms. And the first thing that gets bandied around on the news is the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is in The Hague, and the members are states. And it is when states charge each other with violations that the court can rule. Now, if the court rules, for example, years ago during the Reagan administration, the court ruled against the United States about something we did in Central America, and the US just ignored it. So that's also complicated. But in any event, the members that will be charged is one state charging another, right? Then, and the International Court of Justice actually dates back to the late 19th century. It had a different name then. Eventually, it was renamed during at the end of World War I. Then it got renamed into the International Court of Justice. And the International Court of Justice is actually, if you look at a map of the Organization of the United Nations, there is a box saying ICJ. It is part of the structure of the United Nations. Then the second mechanism that exists to bring people to heel is the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court, states had to sign up on it, but it has the authority to charge individuals with crimes and not simply states. Right. And that court came into being in 2003, and a lot of countries signed on to it. The United States did not, but that's a separate story. We often don't sign on to treaties because while presidents may want to sign on to it, Congress then refuses to have the United States sign the treaty on the argument that it encroaches on our sovereignty, and that's an old issue of why many treaties in the world of things we believe in, the rights of the child, and all kinds of things like that, are not something that we've signed on to, even though we often adhere to it. So the International Criminal Court is, in theory, a place where individuals, and not just states, can be brought to heel. And what are the categories that the International Criminal Court can deal with? Well, actually, it can also deal with genocide. It can deal with crimes against humanity. It can deal with war crimes, and it can deal with a crime of aggression. In other words, it cannot just charge individuals, but it can also charge states and or the policies of states and or individuals acting on behalf of the states. Now, the problem here is that those countries that are not signatories to the states, of course, don't think this court has any authority to try anybody. On the other hand, individuals can be tried by the court even when the state does not, from whence they come, does not cooperate. So what kind of cases have gone to the International Criminal Court? Well, some of the violations of individuals in Uganda, in the Sudan, by and large, African countries. And there are now some people who have been convicted and they are in jail in The Hague. Both of these courts, by the way, are located in The Hague and Holland. So individuals can be convicted, but it takes years of evidence to get enough evidence to feel comfortable that individuals can be tried. Either they could be heads of state, they could be just individual soldiers, depending on which crime is getting treated. So in many ways, most people feel that if and when there are attempts to try Russians for the crimes that they have committed during this conflict in the Ukraine, that it will be the International Criminal Court, where charges will be brought and individuals will be tried. Now, one of the problems of trying individuals in the International Criminal Court is that you've got to have evidence. And it's not just enough that people die. You have to prove that people were actually tortured, or that people were deported, or that real aggression took place, or that the aggression was against the sovereignty of the state, which might be something in the Ukraine. In other words, there are various statutes and various ways that you can bring charges in the International Criminal Court, but it takes years to amass the evidence to make it clear that that's what's going to happen. Now, in many conflicts or many cases when crimes are committed that would fall under the auspices of the International Criminal Court, the evidence was not carefully collected. This is one big difference in the case of the Ukraine, because in the case of the Ukraine, everybody is aware of the fact that all this evidence will be necessary. So there's endless collection of information in those small towns where everybody got killed, all the local citizens, so forth. Everybody's collecting, international agencies, the Red Cross, everybody is collecting evidence, photos, whatever. So in the case of Ukraine, I think there will be far more evidence ready to be, taken to the court to prosecute individuals. What are the other kind of problems with this? The problems for the International Criminal Court also is that when somebody has committed a crime, being an individual or a unit, or for that matter, leaders of a state, the state gets the first dibs at trying individuals. So let me go back to Lieutenant Cali. He was not tried in The Hague at the International Criminal Court. He was tried, if it had existed then, but it didn't. But if it had, he was tried in the United States. That is to say, if individuals in your society have violated any of those 4 categories of crimes, the state has the first opportunity to try the individual. It's only if the state either doesn't have the capacity or the desire or willingness to try individuals that it goes to this international mechanism. So there are many challenges here. And because there's so many challenges, you can go back to square one, which is because it's so difficult, or has been so difficult, to try individuals and or statesmen and or states at the International Court of Justice or at the International Criminal Court, it has not in the past served for much of a deterrence, because most people who commit violations of human rights, who are, committing crimes against humanity and all these other 3 categories, are never brought to trial, right? They get away with it. So you have a chance, if you are committing a violation as an individual or your army or your state, that nothing will happen. You can say for years, well, we'll deal with this, then you don't deal with this, then information has to be collected in The Hague. The state says, well, you're wanting to try these individuals, we'll probably try them, then it doesn't happen. So it's very difficult to get to the point where the International Criminal Court says, we're going to try this individual. And the other thing is that to bear in mind that states, as non-participating states, can also bring charges. For example, you may remember Pinochet in Chile. A member of this system of international law having to do with crimes against humanity, a state that is party to these treaties and conventions, can, as a state, prosecute an individual. So, for example, Spain had decided that it might be able to charge and try and convict Pinochet. Pinochet, it turns out, died before any of this happened. And Belgium, for example, at various points has started proceedings of crimes of various Africans who were charged with genocidal activities or other crimes against humanity. So we've got a very complicated network here of things. And as I said, and I keep repeating, it often doesn't serve as a deterrent. States will say, well, we can get away with it, nothing happens. The other thing is that you would think, for example, in the case of the Ukraine, that every state in the world would recognize that there are war crimes here, crimes against humanity, horrible things happen in the Ukraine. And yet a fairly large number of states will say, we don't really want to get involved in this. There are probably crimes committed on both sides. And in any event, many of the countries that are screaming that that Russia is violating all of these humanitarian international laws, they themselves have committed crimes. And there's actually a lot of truth to it, because various mercenary groups, for example, in Iraq, Americans, either mercenary Americans or American soldiers, committed war crimes. Were they tried? Not really. Were there efforts to try people? Not really. Is what has been happening in Guantanamo crimes against humanity? Yes, people were tortured. Is the U.S. being tried anywhere? No, of course not. Have the people in the U.S. government or the military at Guantanamo, have they been tried for violating the human rights of the prisoners? So lots of torture, lots of war crimes have been committed in Iraq, in Afghanistan, for example, by the U.S. Has anything happened? No. Small countries have done similar things. As we speak, you can actually say genocide in its pure form is being committed in Ethiopia against the Tigrayan people. Is that coming to our attention? Is anything going to happen there? Maybe yes, maybe no. So it is very uneven in terms of to the extent to which crimes against humanity and genocide either are identified at the international level for requiring international action, or maybe in the first instance, national action. Now, is the current Ethiopian government going to try its own forces for committing genocide against the Tigrans? No, it happens to be the policy. They're not going to do anything. Is anybody going to bring this to The Hague, to the International Criminal Court? Maybe yes, maybe no. So part of the problem of international law in this, even when it's really clear, as in the case of Ukraine, that there are two courts, but in the main, the International Criminal Court, which would have authority and jurisdiction to address some of the crimes that are being committed by the Russians in the Ukraine. Maybe they'll get away with it. Maybe they won't get away with it. It might take years, right? And that means that the main purpose of these conventions, the Genocide Convention, the international, the legislation, the UN, the crimes against humanity, and all of that are really, really difficult to prosecute, and they take a long time. And I must say that in the case of Ukraine, because of the media, because of the record keeping, because there's so much information, it might be easier to address some of this down the road. But even there, it is not an easy road. And the main point I think I want to make is that it looks great, crimes against humanity, detailing them, genocide, aggression, which seems obvious in this case, but the Russians will claim it's not obvious. All of these things look really good on paper, and many of us deeply believe that, and in these laws, in these conventions, and are glad they exist. Yet in practice in international affairs, there is a big gap between existence of these good legal preventative measures of how war should be enacted when war does take place, and how aggression is a crime, how genocide is a crime, and all of these. But it is mighty difficult to be able to argue that a country like Russia or any other country, whether it's within the country or between countries, is actually deterred because of this great body of really interesting international law and this great institutions that now exist, which in theory could be a wonderful way of dealing with and therefore deterring future bad behavior, but in fact are quite weak in their actual ability to deter things. And therefore we see ongoing in the Ukraine huge violations of human rights. I could spend, several hours detailing them all, but you see them on the screen. And yet one has to hold one's breath before you can imagine that either something will be done, and if something can be done, whether it will deter this kind of bad behavior in the future. Thanks very much for listening. And as I said, I'll come back on May 30th.